the Modern Life podcast. We are covering the most whispery movie ever, Dune. All right, kids, welcome back. You can find us at modernlifepodcast.com and on Instagram and Twitter at modernlifepod, and also email us at modernlifepod@gmail.com. I have Jason back with me from the Future Cities podcast. I'll have everything linked below so you can find him over there. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll give it over to Princess Arulin from Dune.
The spice exists on only one planet in the entire universe. A desolate, dry planet with vast deserts. Hidden away within the rocks of these deserts are a people known as the Fremen, who have long held a prophecy that a man would come, a Messiah, who would lead them to true freedom. The planet is Arrakis, also known as Dune.
All right, we're back. Welcome back, Jason. So good to have you back at Modern Life Podcast. How you doing?
Doing great, surviving as best as one can. I got to hit the trails the other day, which is really the thing that keeps me sane even in normal times. So as long as I can keep doing that, I'm probably fine.
Those are closed for us.
Yeah, so I definitely illegally
I see.
hiked. So yes, they are closed, but also yes, there is no one enforcing the fact that these trails are supposed to be closed. So
interesting.
It works out.
All right.
How you doing? How's the Modern Life pod?
It's doing good. We're doing good. Everything's on track. Yes. So what is your modern thought for us today?
I guess I should have run this by you previously, but you haven't had anyone talk about Tiger King on your show yet, correct?
No, and I see all the memes online, so I feel like I've watched it. I wasn't sure if it was a documentary or like a made-up show. Yeah.
So, I mean, I cannot recommend it enough. I also avoided it. I really don't like Netflix shows in general. I just don't. There's been nothing that they've produced that has really inspired me, but this one has really hooked me. It is a documentary, and it is just kind of about people who work in the tiger breeding and tiger rescue. I mean, it is interesting enough that they have a brief appearance by this one fellow tiger owner, who it turns out is probably the inspiration for the character that Scarface is based off of, Tony Montana. And it's incredible because of all the people on this show. He is probably the most believable and trustworthy person in the entire series. It's just incredible. They talk to him briefly, and he kind of goes over his history. He is a Cuban immigrant. He was involved with the drug trade. He was also involved with the killing and dismemberment of a police officer, and he comes off as actually the most chill and normal person of the bunch. It's incredible.
Wait, how is this legal, the tiger breeding thing?
I mean, these are all valid questions. So one of them is in Oklahoma. So I don't know if it's state laws that regulates the legality of breeding certain animals and other animals. So cattle breeding is, of course, probably legal in all states, but exotic animal breeding is maybe a bigger problem. I think exotic animal trading, an imported exotic animal, is probably illegal in all states, but we have a bunch that are already here. And this stuff was pretty legal up through what seems like the early, at least the mid 90s, was pretty legal, or at least very poorly regulated. Pretty much everyone in this documentary got started on it back in the 90s.
How do they afford it?
Well, for a lot of people, they don't. They basically just go into massive amounts of debt, but they do spend a lot of time going over people's strategies to actually make this profitable. Because even just the feed alone, I forget how many millions of dollars you have to spend every year feeding these tigers. And one of these guys, Joe Exotic, who most of the memes are based on, has 227 tigers on his property, and that's not even including all of the other animals that he has, like wolves, several types of primates as well. And like he's in Oklahoma, so it's not like he's getting massive amounts of tourism like you would if you were in a state like, I don't know, somewhere closer to New York City or in California, close to Los Angeles or something. So it's really amazing that he's scraping by it all with this. But like there's good portions of the show where they're talking about how he basically dumpster dives Walmart for all the deli meats that get thrown out and feeds his tiger with those. So there's like a scene where they just dump out all this package of lunch meat, and you get the idea that, oh, you're feeding these tigers like Oscar Mayer bologna, at least to some extent in their diet. It's incredible.
Oh, God.
And then otherwise, I mean, they're literally like signing loans in their elderly parents' names, and the elderly parents are just like, I didn't understand. My son put a piece of paper in front of me, so I signed it. Every one of them is just like so different. Even their parents are so different. Like I couldn't get my parents to sign anything without them like reading it thoroughly, because they inherently don't trust me. The idea that like, well, my son, the guy who got involved with tiger breeding, is probably very trustworthy and probably, knows what he's doing. Let me just sign this piece of paper that is putting my name on like a mortgage. It's insane.
Oh my God.
I can't recommend it enough. I mean, you'd think that the tigers would be the like main show in a tiger breeding documentary, but they are far from it. And again, it's like incredible enough that like Tony Montana is a minor character and not even like the most interesting one there, and also probably the most honest character that they show of the bunch. It's just incredible.
So mine is, I was trying to come up with something that's not Corona related, and I didn't. I'm sorry, but I find it very interesting seeing online, because I follow a lot of book accounts on Instagram. I find it really interesting that people are reading things that are very predictable. And I think when a time when you're dealing with this much stress and uncertainty, that is reflected in the media we consume. So I see a lot more people reading romance, because you're guaranteed that happy end. And I see a lot of people reading cozies. So cozies are the detective mysteries, like the golden age of detective stories, like Agatha Christie stuff. Back between the wars, that became really popular because you kind of wanted to deal with that trauma of like all the things that you just went through. Even if you're back home, as a country, there's murder, but you don't really ever see it on the page. It's about these big estates, and the detective always, he always solves the mystery by the end, so it's predictable and you always get what you paid for, kind of. So I just find that so interesting that people are going back to these things to kind of self-soothe, I guess. Sure.
It's very relatable here. We're talking about a book that probably a lot of people read during their adolescence. I actually missed it during my adolescence. I read it in my mid-20s for the first part, but it is kind of just a sci-fi story that is like a very boyish fantasy about like what you can be in a lot of ways, and we can get into the other stuff soon, but it is interesting though that people are going back to those sorts of genres.
But that's a perfect transition. We can get started on the book.
Hey, perfect.
So we're talking about Dune by Frank Herbert. The book came out in 1965, and the movie by David Lynch came out in 1984. So this was my first time reading this book, and I was actually looking online for like a nice edition so I could have something, that looks nice on my bookshelf. And I was looking at first editions. A first edition of this book cost $10,000.
Oh my God.
That's not actually a lot. If you compare that to something like Anne of Green Gables, first editions will go for like in the $30,000 range. But it is the most expensive first edition in the sci-fi genre, which I did not know. So
that's surprising. I'm trying to think of like some of the other classic sci-fi books that, like Ender's Game, probably it's not as good as this, but I feel like it's just as big of a name potentially. Right. Not being alive during that era, I don't know how much of a phenomenon Dune was at the time, but it certainly is still kind of reverberating. Clearly they're making a movie of it, or at least we're planning on releasing a movie later this year of it.
So let's get into kind of explaining what goes on in this book. I think we have a lot of feuding noble families. Of course, the desert planet Dune. This is really more of like a philosophical, but also ecological kind of sci-fi story, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree.
So we have the Atreides family living on a very lush planet that's very green with a lot of water. They then get sent to supervise spice production on the planet Dune. Spice is something that people need to travel through time. I'm not quite sure how it works. Travel through space.
Space and time.
Yes.
It allows you to fold space, basically, as I think the way they explain it.
But yeah, they get kind of stranded on this planet. Immediately stuff goes down. The family gets attacked. The mom and the son, so the heir, Paul Atreides, escape and find kind of the natives of Dune. And he rebuilds his army to take revenge and become the religious messiah of Dune. What else happens in this story?
Yeah, I mean, it covers a lot of ground. Yeah, I mean, rebuild his army and then also recruits a small army of giant sandworms, as one does when you're vacationing. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it in terms of the broad plot involved in this book. You did describe it as like ecologically focused and philosophically focused. Those are really cool elements to it. I think this book was written, or at least the original serialization of this book was written, I believe, a couple of years after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, it is like the quintessential publication about ecological change and man's effect on the natural world. So Rachel Carson was originally inspired by the effects of basically spraying pesticides across large swaths of middle America and farmlands, and the devastation that it has on the insect population. So Silent Spring refers to the fact that they used to just spray so many pesticides over the land that you wouldn't hear bugs anymore. And that was a real striking thing for her. And she wrote this really graphic sort of description of the huge effect that pesticides and other things that humans were doing to the land were having on the natural world. And it's cited, as kind of like a major game changer, or like paradigm change in the way that humans think about their relationship to nature, or at least more specifically, white Americans thinking about their relationship to nature in America. So, this is a much more thin population than I think people realize, but it's still like an incredible thing. And like that took off. It really got quite popular among the general population of the United States. And so then there was kind of this wave of other sort of ecologically minded stories, both fiction and nonfiction, that were getting published by various magazines and being turned into books. And I think Frank Herbert was partially riding that wave. He himself, I believe, was partially inspired by having moved to a part of Oregon where there's actually quite a bit of sand dunes. And they were trying to plant a bunch of this one kind of grass, I'm forgetting the name of it, in order to kind of root the sand dunes in place. Because, they would kick up and you'd have these huge dust storms and they're really destructive. And if you try to build a town too close to like a sand dune area, really the sand can't just like move in. So he also was kind of seeing the effects of human terraforming and manipulation of the environment, and was partially inspired by that. Yes. Sorry, that's probably enough commentary along those lines.
That's brilliant. I had no idea about any of this. And I was actually gonna, you kind of anticipated my question, because as one of the hosts of the Future Cities podcast, you talk a lot about that relationship and how do we best kind of interact with the environments around us in a way that's healthy for nature and also for human beings. So no, this was perfect. But I also wanted to ask you, so as somebody who knows this kind of science a lot, are you able to immerse yourself in the world of Dune? Or is it so, because this planet is fictional, it can't really exist. There's, they don't really know what water is, yet there's this whole society living on this planet. are you able to kind of let go and get into it? Or are you like, oh, well, this doesn't actually make any sense?
I mean, there's two levels to this. One is that I, grew up just a huge fantasy and sci-fi nerd to the point where I wouldn't read Harry Potter when everyone else got into it, because I read the summary of it and I was like, this is a book about children going to school. And that is the most limited idea of what fantasy and sci-fi is. I'm not wasting my time on this. I'm not defending that opinion nowadays, but this is just letting you know how pretentious and how into fantasy and sci-fi I was back then. And so, like, it is pretty easy for me to immerse myself, even in like bad sci-fi and bad fantasy. I have the mentality for it. But I mean, like, Dune is pretty richly realized. There's some stuff that probably is nonsense. I mean, they go from the sort of like grounded, dry lands ecology kind of thinking on Dune, which is much more rooted probably in Frank Herbert's experience. And I think it shows. I think he has a real appreciation for how life can and does adapt to these sorts of extreme dry land environments, which now that I live in Arizona and I'm going to school here at Arizona State in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, I really have an appreciation for, him really kind of delving down into what it takes to be a person living in the desert and like having a community also living in the desert. But I mean, then there's like so many just other absurd parts about this. I mean, you can't really talk about Dune without also talking about like the colonialist element of it, because, there's like this native people there. Paul's father, Duke Leto, and Paul himself both are thinking about the native population in terms of their ability to potentially be the new army for this monarchy. Like the House Atreides is a monarchy, and like they want a new army, so they're trying to enlist the native people basically in a fight against like another house. There's so much going on in this book. I mean, the ecological side is cool and I really appreciate it. But then also just like some of the fantasy stuff is also great, just in terms of, I think it's just very richly realized, and I really appreciate it for what it is. Like the giant sandworms rule. I mean, you see this in the movie too, where like the sandworms actually end up being very cool. Like they are really well realized in the book. And then in parts of the movie, when the CGI and puppets aren't totally terrible, they look really good. I still have like the adolescence fist pumping hell yeah, like whenever the worms are tearing shit up.
When they're on top of the worm and they're riding it in the movie, there is like a electric guitar riff that gets going. And it was like it made me feel so amazing watching it. Like I felt like I was riding that worm. I was like, I got really into it.
Yeah, like the movie soundtrack, I believe, doesn't even include rock music or electronic guitars or anything up until those moments.
No, yeah.
They really do save it for like, all right, you are riding the worm. It is sick as hell. And like, oh God, those scenes are so funny. Also, like this, they are just like on a green screen in the background, and are riding kind of a thing that looks vaguely ridged, like the worms that they've been showing previously. It rules, and it's also just like so bad looking. It's also flat, like it's a totally flat shot. You're just like looking at you're just looking at the characters head on while they hold these like reins that go beyond the edges of the screen. Right. So you're just like, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there are parts of this that I love, and also now that I live in the desert, I'm like, hell yeah, there's worms everywhere out here. But
So the worm riding, I actually wasn't too hard on it in the movie because it was nonsense in the book to me. So I'm like, so this movie did really the best it could with what it was given, because they always talk about how if a worm comes up, the sand is just collapsing, right? And you're not even just running away from the worm, you're running away from the sand, like sucking you under. Yet suddenly you can run up right next to it and like climb up it and then like hook these things. So if it's like a ridged worm that has these like shells that you're trying to lift up to expose like the soft underside of it so the worm doesn't go back underground, wouldn't you then have to lift up like the shells behind you? Like it makes no sense. Like I can't think about it too much. So that's why I'm like, the movie did okay. It was fine.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of those moments where just like, well, David Lynch gets a hard time for this movie, but also the text itself is absurd.
Right.
Like there's so many parts about it where you're just like, what are you going to do? Reinvent the entire worm and anger all the nerds who have read this book? Or are you just going to kind of go with it and be like, yeah, the tool that they use in the movie where it's like a shovel with like two spikes on the sides of it where you like pry it up and it kind of wedges in there. It was believable. Like I looked at that and I was like, yeah, I get what you're doing there. Good job, David Lynch.
So I wanted to say something about the writing of this book, and
Yes.
and then I will explain it. But let me just say it
Go
first. For it. This book is badly written, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have like a really great narrative. The world building is totally on point. I'm not saying that there's not good things in this book. But I could literally go through this with like a red marker and be like, too many frequent switching of points of view, really horrible exposition and explaining to me what's going on. Bad word repetition. People are never just turning around. They're always whirling around every single time Chani shows up.
Yeah.
Every single time Chani shows up on the page, the author has to tell me that her face is elfin. Literally every single time. I'm like, yeah, I get it. I get that her face is elfin. I got it. There's also like the wrong word choice for some of the actions that are happening. Nonstop, meaningless, made-up words that I refuse to keep track of. I don't know what any of them mean, and I got too angry to look them up. And then actually it took me about 100 pages to get into this book. And then I found out that the publishing house wanted to cut the first 100 pages, and they actually broke with him after this one. And the subsequent books came out with a different publishing house because he wouldn't like change anything. Like this book just so badly needed an editor, but if you're like a white guy in the 60s or whatever, I think you can, I guess, just do whatever you want and people will publish it.
Sorry, just one clarification here. So I believe the Wikipedia says that the final publisher for it normally put out like auto repair manuals. Did you also find that information?
No, I did not see that, but that makes sense.
Yeah, the novel Dune was finally accepted and published in August 1965 by Chilton Books, a printing house better known for publishing auto repair manuals. So,
But they were even the ones who were like, no, you need to cut this, and this. Like, they even know what was going on. And Frank Herbert was just like, no, I refuse. And then once book 3 starts, there is like needlessly confusing timeline stuff where I was constantly skipping back pages and being confused about what was happening, that there was no need to confuse me like that, because book 3 says it's about 2 years later. Then they say next chapter they say Paul is over 18 when he was 15 before. Then suddenly the sister is 2 years old. Next thing that happens, there's a battle where she's suddenly a 4-year-old demon child, and I'm like, where are we? What time is it? I'm like, why are you confusing me so much about like where we are in the timeline?
Yeah, it totally kind of breaks down toward in book 3, as you correctly identify. And that also breaks down very clearly in the movie too, but we can get into that later.
I wish the writing was better, but I'm glad this was made. I'm sorry I'm hating on it.
No. The writing is really bad. It's also funny because I believe he was a professional writer. I think Frank Herbert was a journalist, if I'm not mistaken. So he is at least as acquainted with a certain form of writing, but it does crack me up. I work with a bunch of scientists, and some of them are really into sci-fi, and some of them will fantasize about trying to like have some kind of writing career, at least on the side or whatever. But like most scientists can barely write science, and like trying to like write prose, like, compelling prose is incredibly difficult. And I don't think people really have or at least in my field, or like I know so many people who like sci-fi and fantasy or whatever, but just have not really thought about like good composition. In part, I think because books like Dune and other ones like The Martian as well Like the prose is garbage. It's really bad.
Yeah.
And if this is like your inspiration, you're probably thinking like, yeah, I can do that.
Oh, interesting.
Compare this to someone like Ray Bradbury has a lot of problems as a writer, but he writes really well. Like I can go through and pick out a sentence from Ray Bradbury in any of his sci-fi novels. Like he just has really good words is the best way I can describe it. But he's not the sort of inspiration for sci-fi that these other big authors are. And that's unfortunate. And I'm glad you pointed this out. I have dog-eared one of my pages in my book to get at just how bad some of the dialogue is here. This sentence just drives me insane. Where it's when they're first introducing the characters of like the Baron Harkonnen and the Mentat Peter, and I don't remember if anyone else is in this scene, Feyd-Rautha. But regardless, I think Peter at one point says the words, "You do not drool very prettily, Baron." And like that's supposed to be a sort of menacing sort of thing, but like "you do not drool very prettily" just is a nonsense sentence because it implies that there is a way to drool in a pretty manner, but then also prettily sucks as a word.
Yeah.
And I don't know, just like everything about it. I'm like, cut this whole sentence, like figure out what you're trying to say because that's bad. Like, I don't know. It's incredible. It's not good.
Can I just to go back to the scientist stuff? When when the planetologist Kynes or Keynes, I don't know what his name is, but when he's first introduced, the Duke says, "Oh, he's a scientist type. He's an art sort of fellow. Has a precise way of speaking, clipped off, no fuzzy edges, razor apt," and just that this book implies that all scientists talk like crazy scientists. As a scientist, Jason, is this true? Do they all talk like that?
I mean, I think there's a certain cohort among scientists who do very well because they have that sort of personality. But I think
that checks out.
I certainly don't talk like that. You've heard me on this podcast several times, and I ramble all the time. Yes, it's great. I love the very one-sided personification of like what a scientist is. Also, he's an ecologist. Like, ecologists are weird people. And I mean that like in a loving, appreciative way, because I am technically an ecologist at this point. But, I mean, we're not physicists, which is more what he seems to be conceiving us.
Okay.
Anyway, good characters, good characterization. One of my favorite things to do with this novel, because you were talking about how difficult the words are, is to get other people's interpretation of how to pronounce any of this stuff. You know, Paul takes the title of Muad'Dib, which is how I end up pronouncing it. The general native population is called it's written Fremen, but it's very clearly supposed to be Freeman, but it's pronounced Fremen, I think.
It's just obnoxious,
and at least that's how it's also pronounced in like the movie. Sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, no, sorry, but they're Freemen, but they're not. Get it?
Yes.
And I'm like, stop annoying the shit out of me. But it's interesting that you just said Peter. I said Peter when I was reading it on the page, but in the movie they call him Piter.
I mean, it's very clear that I'm trying to think of a good example of this. So, I mean, like, think of how the elves talk in, like, Lord of the Rings. Like, there's a proper language. They hired someone to, like, come up with a...
Oh, no. Oh, hold on. Sorry. Tolkien came up with that language. It's, like, a legitimate language with grammatical rules. So...
Yeah.
Tolkien is on its own. He's on his own level. I know people compare like this a lot to Tolkien, and I get it because it's just like annoying minutia that nerds love to remember and test the other nerds on. And like, are you a true nerd? So, sorry. Go back to what you were saying. I got a little. I turned into one of those nerds just now. That's all.
Oh no, that's totally legit. I couldn't remember if it was more developed in the films or if it was in the books. I have read Tolkien, but I'm not the biggest Tolkien head. I don't think I've read like the Silmarillion or whatever. And you're going to get murdered if by nerds listening to this podcast who I've mispronounced that. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, it's very clear that there's not a consistency of language or grammatical structure or anything like that with regard to the Fremen or the Freemen, because all these words are just like nonsense. The Bene Gesserit presumably have their own kind of language that they speak, or are borrowing words from something else because they have that one needle called the Jom Gabar or whatever. It's just, one of these things where it's so distracting because
Yeah.
even like words from the same community just look like they have no relation to each other at all. And then they just straight up use the word jihad to describe like the Fremen disposition, you know. And it's just like, all right, so you've just totally given up the fact that, yes, you're writing about Arabs or like a Muslim community in general. Like these people are the Muslims in your book.
Well, that's another thing that really bothered me in the movie is that these people are very clearly coded as Arabs, and it talks all the time how you have to be like so adapted to the desert. So all the people, they're all white people being adapted to the desert is looking like us. I don't think so. I don't do well in the sun. So yeah, that really bothered me in the movie, but it's also the 80s and only white people exist in Hollywood. So.
Right. Yeah.
I just have one more thing marked here. Something that really didn't age well is I think we always make fun of like women having to be like innocent and sexy at the same time.
Yeah.
But there's a quote here by the Princess Arulan that starts off one of the chapters, which is like so serious. It talks about like the Bene Gesserit. And she says, the Reverend Mother must combine the seductive wiles of a courtesan with the untouchable majesty of a virgin goddess. And that's how you get your power. And it's like seeing like a male writer write that in the 60s and being so serious about it. And I'm just like, oh boy. Just made me laugh.
Yeah, there's no subtextual analysis to be done. It is just explicit. Yeah, and speaking of, gosh, so I mean the box that Paul has to put his hand in at the very beginning is very much just a good physical grounding of the description of like who the Bene Gesserit have to be. Where like you have to put your hand in the box, you can't see it. It's like indescribable pain, but there's something that like draws you to it, and then they're holding like a poisonous gom jabbar, which is just a needle with some poison in it, up to your neck. Like it's very much like that whole thing just kind of sets up the sort of like Bene Gesserit allure more or less, and like the danger hidden behind them. That, I mean, it's just incredible. You're putting your hand in a box and it's just all this subtext just made, you know, blown up to on a loudspeaker, you know, at 11. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it doesn't age well.
No, and they keep remaking it. This is part of the reason why I wanted to like do this for your show, because it's like I guess we're doing another movie after doing like 2 series like on sci-fi and having done this original movie. For some reason, we keep revisiting this text, in spite of the fact that, you know, there's, I don't know, probably thousands of sci-fi novels that have been written in the period since this book first came out that are probably better than this.
Well, something that also we talked about this being about terraform, about ecology, about philosophy, what is it, you know, religious fanaticism. And then the movie's like, you know what? All these themes, throw them out the window. I don't need any of them. This is now an action movie.
Yes.
This is now, I read the book and this clearly needs to be made into a body horror action movie. That's what the people want.
Yes.
I'm like, what? How? Why?
Yeah. I mean, it really makes Star Wars seem much more politically subtle. And,
yeah.
You know, and I think it was kind of, it's just incredible. They take all this stuff and like throw it out and like, actually, all these people are good. When in the book, it's very like, you know, there's some tension in whether or not Paul is actually good. And I mean, we can get into the political themes of this later, but you're right. They just are like, yep, it's just like an action adventure. There's no tension whatsoever. I can't tell if we were ever supposed to think that Paul and his army was supposed to lose, because there's never really, they don't build tension. There's like no shot of them like potentially on the brink of losing during like the final battles or anything like that. They don't really have anything that they overcome. They just kind of keep kicking ass and like getting cooler.
Which is, it's like that in the book. You know, in the beginning of the book, the dad is going to die, that Paul is going to become the emperor. You get that right away. So they took all that, but then took out well, what does that mean to have these people who are religiously tied to you and see you as this great leader? you're right. You either have to then build tension for like an action movie, or you have to go with the source material. And they tried to mesh them both together, and it didn't work. I didn't even think about that until you just said that.
Yeah, it's I unfortunately did not get to go back and read the third book of this novel before this podcast, because I really wanted to see if it's that much different than David Lynch's interpretation of it. Because I know so David Lynch shot 4 hours worth of film, cut it down, and then cut it down again to like a 2-hour-ish film. And so there's potentially a lot that got left, that got lost on the chopping block that maybe would have been a more interesting film. But like for the last 30, 40 minutes of the film, you're just kind of like on for the ride. There's no tension whatsoever. It's just like, hell yeah, they're riding the worm. Hell yeah, those worms aren't responding at all to whatever the laser blasters are trying to do to them. No, they're just going to fuck that city up. And just like, it's incredible. There's no tension whatsoever. It's just like sick scene after sick scene, and everyone's high-fiving each other.
Oh god.
Yes. And I mean, like, and then David Lynch goes above and beyond all of that too by adding Patrick Stewart holding the royal pug, who does not appear in the novel. The pug is not part of the book, if I'm not mistaken.
No, yeah, it doesn't. No, we are not going to say anything negative about that scene, because it is the best thing to have ever happened. So let me just walk you through my personal experience. Okay, so I'm watching this, and there's all these animals in this movie. Again, why did you read this book and go, it needs more animals? We need a furless cat. And I just don't understand. So now if there's like an animal in danger in a movie, I either turn off the movie or like I can't concentrate on what's happening. So they have a scene of the pug just kind of in the hallway. People are running around. There's a battle. And I'm like, well, now I don't care about the battle. I just want to make sure the pug is okay. And the pug is going to get abandoned in this palace. Next scene is Patrick Stewart. He's holding the pug inside his jacket. He's got a blast rifle that he's just shooting like crazy. He's screaming like, death to all the Harkonnens, and like just runs out of there. And I'm like, yes, Patrick Stewart, like, he saw me through this. He knew exactly what I needed. I needed that dog to be okay. And then in the screenshot that I've sent to like 5 people already, the pug has like the most determined look on its face. Like, the pug is in the scene. The pug is like a character actor. The best trained dog. That scene is amazing.
Yeah. So have you seen The Godfather?
I tried. I'm sorry, I can't. I tried so many times.
No, it's totally fine. I only really just watched The Godfather maybe 2 years ago, so there goes all my film cred. But The Godfather has like one of the greatest opening scenes in film, not because of like the tension or the setup or whatever. It's because Marlon Brando is holding this cat that is desperately trying to get out of his lap and is like biting his hand and clawing at him. And the backstory on that is that he found it just like on like offsets, and I forgot the proper term for, where they shoot the moving pictures, like on the studio lot, basically. He found this cat and like was determined to bring it into the scene and use that as like a character development thing for this character, in spite of like the director getting pissed about it, in spite of like what a nightmare that was for costuming and the people who have to make sure that the shots are consistent with each other and like the cat's in the same position and all of that. Mm-hmm. And my thoughts immediately went back to The Godfather and thinking of all that. We're like, did Patrick Stewart, look at this pug and was like, no, we got to include him in another scene. I want to be the hero who brings the pug out of this. And people are like, oh, come on, Patrick Stewart. And he's like, nope, this is what I have to do. This is my tribute to Marlon Brando.
But then the pug never comes back. I was hoping we would find out that Patrick Stewart has been taking care of it, or no, I'm sure it's living its best life, but we don't ever.
Or that they've like started feeding it spice, and you get like a blue eye glow out of the pug as like the last ominous scene or something. Like, oh no, the pug has powers too now.
That scene though, where Patrick Stewart and Paul meet each other again in the desert, I may have cried at that. I may have felt something in that moment. I don't
I
know.
mean, we all want Patrick Stewart to see us and, look extremely happy to see us and like clasp us and, give us a pat on the back and be like, I'm glad you're doing well. Like, thank you,
Aw.
Patrick Stewart. We all want that in our lives. It's very relatable.
I want to talk about Paul. I had a lot of trouble with Paul as a character until I looked up that the point of this book was supposed to be about somebody who's this all-powerful messiah. What does that mean when we don't judge or see clearly our religious leaders who then also have political power? And
Sure.
then as soon as I saw that this was a commentary, I was like, oh, like I got it. Because before that, Paul wasn't a relatable or interesting character. And then when I found out that that's the point, I felt a lot better with Paul and his storyline. Because he has the personality of a wet rag. He's so boring. Once he becomes like all-knowing and all-powerful, he becomes even more annoying to me. Because he'll just walk into a room and be like, oh, from the airflow in this room, I know there's a secret entrance over there. And I'm like, Paul, shut the fuck up. Like, no, you don't. But the actor actually, I thought, did such a great job. I loved watching him on screen. I loved he had really great diction and the way he was saying things. I really enjoyed the actor in the movie.
Yes, he is great. And I'm blanking on his name
I have
and
no
again
idea.
destroying any cred. I mean, he plays the main character on Twin Peaks.
Yes, but I never watched that show. Sorry.
I only ever watched a portion of the first season. Man, I am just killing my cred through all of this. But yeah, I mean, he's great. His hair is also incredible.
Amazing.
I watched it with a friend, and we tried to figure out if the hair was real or if there were extensions in there. I mean, the hairline is real, but it's very long and very blown out. I still maintain that it's all real.
No,
but
it's
my
real.
friend thinks that there's extensions in there. I don't know.
No. They all had that hair. I don't know. I've seen pictures of like my parents during that time. They all had that hair. It is possible because everybody was doing it.
Yeah, I mean, like, even when he also shows up in Portlandia, and he's still got, like, a great hairline and still looks like he could grow that out if he really wanted to. It's incredible. It's somehow light and has, like, volume to it, but even in the sand, it's not, like, blowing around in his face too much. You would think it'd be distracting, but it's totally not. It just kills in every scene. And, when you're first reading this, or I think if you're an adolescent or something, you probably don't pick up on the sort of critical aspects of it. You're just like, yeah, hell yeah, sweet dude who comes down, gets his army, gets to ride the worm, does all this shit that women can't possibly do, which at multiple points Frank Herbert makes very clear that, like, normally this is something that women can do. And then Paul does it, and not only does it, like, accomplishes whatever the task is, but does it way better than any of the women in this book have ever done it, which is this, kind of disgusting fantasy in general. But then, like, all of these people are bad. I mean, the B'nai Gesserit it's like a shadowy organization of women who are, like, basically doing eugenics and trying to come up with, like, the ultimate bloodline and kind of controlling how these houses marry each other and have their own ability to manipulate, like, the gender of their children. And I mean, it's just, like, straight up the worst race science stuff possible. So you should already be kind of suspect of them, in spite of the fact that there's not really a lot of critical language in the book about it. The houses are all monarchies. They're coming down. They're doing colonialism, trying to just use these local people toward their own ends and so forth. Like, no one in this book is good, except for arguably, like, the Fremen, who are just trying to liberate their planet or whatever.
Yeah, but even they, by the end, become, like, these religious fanatics.
Yeah. Right. And that is, like, also especially complicated because, of course, they're supposed to be, Muslims.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah.
Are Arabs, where it's just like, yeah, sure, maybe you could tame the Orientals, but then their religious fervor is so strong that maybe, I mean, it's just, like, incredible. None of these people are good. And Paul is especially bad. Do you know much about, like, the additional, like, the books beyond this one?
So I looked up, he later on becomes blind, right? And he, like, secludes himself from everyone, and then his sister tries to take over. And then there's, like, a feud between the Princess Arulin and Chani. where whoever gets the heir has the most power or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't read much of the other ones too, but I've also read and heard synopses of it. But he just, Paul continues to become all, incredibly more powerful. And I don't know if he eventually becomes a sandworm. That might be ultimately where it ends up. Who knows where they end up going with these books. I think he also loses his dick at some point and just, makes a point to mention the fact that he no longer has a penis in various parts in the additional novels.
Huh.
It gets crazy. So he's already insufferable, and he only gets worse. And then in addition to him just being like, it's good that this book is supposed to be critical of these various themes, but it also in giving him all these powers, it's another thing that just totally destroys any tension whatsoever. Because it's just like, oh, okay, so he just has these abilities to tap into the unseen forces, not only in the immediate room, but now once he drinks the water of life and becomes the Quizak Hatteract. I don't know how you want to pronounce that.
How do you know all these names? I refuse to learn them. Such a nerd.
He can now sense movements in the entire universe and so forth. And it's just okay, so you won. And we still have 150 more pages to go for some reason.
Right.
And then an additional 5 other books. It's crazy. I don't know how you write that much about this.
The next character I kind of had a lot to say about was the Baron.
Yeah.
Because...
As you should.
As I should. This is one of the worst villains I've ever, not worse as in he does bad things, but badly written. Because the markers that Frank Herbert uses to say oh, look how evil he is, again, is something that really did not age well. And I'm really curious to see how they would do it in the new movie. Because a few scenes through, I was was Frank Herbert a homophobe? And then I looked it up, and yes, he was. Because homosexuality in the book is used as saying, oh, don't you look how evil this character is. He's homosexual.
Yes, yeah.
The fat phobia in this was another thing that drove me crazy. This is a quote from the book. Caressing his bulges, his fat has to be suspended in midair. He's constantly hungry. Every single sentence ends with is there more food?
Yes. I think his first introduction is his fat hand touched a globe or something like that. Yeah, I mean they go to such lengths to talk about his fatness, where when I first read the book, I would mentally interject or add to the end of every sentence that the Baron says with "he said fatly," just because it's so detestable. It's his most detestable quality about him.
And it's also so one of the chapters ends with him raping an underage boy, and then fantasizing about that boy being Paul, which is his grandson. And it just seemed like one of those writing styles that's so Game of Thrones, oh, ha ha ha, look at how edgy I am in writing this character. I don't know if this was groundbreaking in the 60s, but it just made me so mad.
Yeah, and I don't know if you wanted to connect it to the movie version of him.
Oh, please, go ahead.
But I mean, the David Lynch interpretation of the character is both fat, check, and gay, check, but also has really disgusting skin conditions. I mean, he's covered in pustules basically all over his face in particular. And in the movie, they're constantly being drained by his doctor and being taken care of. And he's bathing in these disgusting liquids and flying through them and so forth.
It's just oil. There's just a scene of him putting his face under oil, and I'm why is this in here?
Yeah, they really they went for the inspiration for this villain is that kid in second grade who sat at your table who ate glue and the erasers off of pencils. That is the most villainous concept possible, and they really leaned into it.
But at least in the I thought the book was bad, and then the movie's even worse than that. Because in the book, he at least is he's kind of intelligent. He does a lot of like political maneuvering. He uses the people around him. And then in the movie, he's just like a clown.
Yeah.
Like the scene where he first flies up in the air, the whole family around him is like just in awe. Like Sting is like, "Oh my God, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen." And I'm like, he's like your uncle. At what point are you like, "Yes, uncle, we know you can fly. I've seen it before," but everybody's just like, "Oh my God."
Well, so one other quick thing about this, and this always cracks me up. So, I mean, it's not really discussed explicitly, but it's kind of implied that he is so fat that he has been given the power to fly. No one else in this book flies. He is literally just so fat that they're like, well, he can't walk under his own power, so he just kind of flies around. Like, it's incredible.
But that poor actor is like barely overweight. Right?
Yeah.
I'm like, he's not even fat.
He is not that rotund. But I will give David Lynch credit. Like Baron Harkonnen isn't likable in general. He is a monarch, and he has he does all this political intrigue where he's trying to get these other people killed, and he's duplicitous, and he's just he's bad for many, many other reasons. But like David Lynch's idea of evil in some ways just like rules so much, where like the scene where you're talking about where he's just like flying around and just like gleefully laughing as he gets sprayed with oil and like he delights in all of that. Like if he was on the ground, he would just be like jumping from foot to foot like an imp. His son, who is played by Sting, who just at one point is like just straight up wearing very skimpy briefs at one point.
I'm like,
and
feed
Sting
feed him. Oh my God, this poor man. Give him a sandwich or something. He's so
Sting
skinny.
is both ripped and starved. And like Baron Harkonnen is just like flying around him and like basically clapping his hands together in like glee in how hot Sting is and like how much he wants to have sex with them. But like just the scene of Baron Harkonnen like flying around and getting drenched by oil and like taking total glee in that, I think is like a fantastic representation of just like the disgusting excess of the wealthy and powerful. If you can divorce all the other negative characteristics of him, it's just like, this guy sucks so badly, and like this is what brings him joy. Like it's pretty brilliant in some ways.
It's a lot. I do want to get into the body horror because I did not do well with it. Like,
oh yeah,
I don't know why everybody is constantly shiny and sweaty. I don't know if this was like a time in Hollywood before setting spray was invented. Like, I don't know if the lights were too hot. Like, every person is oozing bodily fluids out of their skin. Like, by the end of the movie, all the guild members are like oozing pus out of their heads, and I'm like, why? Since when? Like, there's a scene where like all the witches, including the demon child, are crying blood because Paul is like drunk in the water or whatever, and I'm like, stop! Like, why? Why the scene with the like poor cat and the rat, and I can see the cat trying to get out of those constraints. Like, I don't know if like animal rights were protected during the making of this movie. Like, why are there so many fetus shots? I don't need to see the fetus all the time. Jason,
I
why?
totally forgot to bring up the cat that is in like the milking cube, and then there's just like a rat that is like duct taped to the side of the cat for some reason.
Why?
It's so good. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why Lynch really went full throttle on that, but it does add a certain element of unwatchability to the film that is frankly impressive.
I mean, no, I'm kind of like really ripping into this movie, and I want to say that David Lynch does not like this film. He refuses to discuss it. He's like, it was bad, I'm sorry, and I don't want to talk about that. And I honestly respect that, because he's not out here like J.J. Abrams thinking he's like God or something. So good for you, David Lynch.
Yeah. I don't even want to like rip into him for it. I mean, there's real glimmers of brilliance in it. I think some things they did really well, and some of the scenes really are good. They do a really good job of conveying the awe of the worms at some point, like when the spice factory first gets devoured by the worm, and that's like your first introduction to like the enormity and the power of them. I think they did. It was a great shot. Whatever the puppets and CGI mix that they used for that, I thought was very good. I think the set pieces that they build in this are generally pretty incredible. Like the palace sets are, like all the gleaming gold on everything is really impressive.
Yeah.
It's all very sharp. So there's like elements of danger to it as well. I think it like communicates some really cool stuff. But then there's just so many like unforgivable and bad elements to it where like if you had tried to watch this movie without having read anything in the book in a theater, you paid money for this. Would you feel anything but like outrage? Even if you like went back and read the book and like later kind of appreciated it, I would just be like, what is happening? Like they spend so much time on like the first 100 pages of the book, like basically an hour and 15 minutes. And then the rest of the book, which is like 300 or 400 pages, depending on the edition you're using, is just jammed in there.
Yeah.
And cut in strange ways. They totally mess up the plot. Not that it was that cohesive in the later elements anyway. Just incredible. But, respect to David Lynch for the good parts, and then also mad respect to him for being like, no, my bad. It was a big steaming pile. And I might have been a little high on my own supply at that point.
This must have also been like to show that you have like made it in Hollywood. I think is measured by how many like electronic puppets are in your movie.
Sure.
Because there are characters in this that are like weird alien creatures that were not alien creatures in the book, or there's no reason for them to be there. It's just like, well, we have the money for this, like, whatever it is, and we need to put it in here. So maybe as a movie watcher in the 80s, I'm like, oh my God, they have a lot of little gremlins in here. Maybe I would be in awe of this movie.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe there is something awesome about it, but oh man, some of the shots, I mean, even consecutive shots of like the worms, it's like, no, the last one was so good. Why is this one so bad? I don't understand.
I wanted to ask you what you thought of the special effects for the shields that they use in the movie.
I'm glad you brought this up. I don't think you can talk about Dune without talking about that. What the hell?
I loved it, but it was also giving me a headache because it's like a blurred filter, and then there's a lot of really quick action, so you really don't see what's happening. Like the stunt choreographer is like, "Why did you hire me? Because you can't even see what I did." Oh God. Yeah.
So to like describe what the shields are. I mean, okay. So I wish I had like written down a description of what the shields are like in the book, because to me, the shields basically adhered to your skin or something like that. I didn't get the impression that they really projected outward from the body necessarily. Did you?
No.
Yeah. So like in the movie, basically think of yourself, as a normal human, and then your shield is like someone made a Minecraft version of you and like you're wearing that. Like that is what it is. It's like extremely blocky, except also the Minecraft version of you is smoked glass. I mean, the descriptions are very different between what you see on the screen and what's seen in the book. But like the movie is like, I don't know. It looks like garbage in some ways, but I also in some ways thought like the interpretation was super cool and like probably very cutting edge at the time.
Right.
And it's like a very radical vision of what the shields could be, where I appreciated the risk that he took on that, even though there's so many other questionable elements of it. It was just like, I don't know that I would have had the confidence to see that through.
I want to talk about the guild scene in the very beginning. So the guild members like come to the emperor and they're like, you have to bring us the spice or whatever. And the guild member, there's like that alien creature in like a tank.
Yeah, that's the emperor. Yeah.
That's
right?
all. No. They're talking to the emperor. And the alien creature is like the guild master, and it's disgusting because, of course, everything in this movie has to be disgusting. But the tank that it's in is like leaking water, And there's just two guys with like steam mops or like vacuums in the background of this like intense scene. Oh, it's just incredible.
I'm really glad you brought this up because I loved this a lot. Number one, like the tank that they're brought in is like cool in general. Like it's huge and it houses, I mean, the alien inside of it is, I mean, another interesting and daring decision by David Lynch that I certainly don't know that I would have the ability to be like, everyone calm down. It's going to look great. This is a good idea. But the tank itself is like a cool idea. But the two people with the steam vacs are so funny. Because like, yeah, the tank comes in and there's like, you know, his coterie of people who are opening the doors, and then like two guys who are, you know, running the dry vacs basically to suck up the water. But they do a totally inadequate job of it. As he's leaving, the two guys with the things like do these two little stripes, but 90% of that area is still just soaked with whatever fluids that tank is producing. And they're just like, you know, later you'll do the rest.
In their defense, they were trying to suck it up before, but everybody's just standing around, not moving out of the way for these like poor workers. And then those hoses are obviously hooked up to the tank, and the tank is leaving. And these guys are trying their hardest, Jason, to do the job that they were hired for. How dare you?
Oh, it rules. I mean, there's so many moments where like I'm not supposed to be laughing about this, but just like what a totally inadequate job and like what a half-assed like measure by this alien creature to be like, we'll clean it up a little. Like I recognize that it's kind of a burden to have me over as a guest, but I'm not going to do it all. Like some of that's on you. Good luck.
You talked about them spending so much time on the beginning of this book. There is a space travel scene that is 2 minutes long. I timed it. It is 2 minutes of screensaver graphics. There's nothing else going on. It's just, I'm like, how did you have time for this? Also, the beginning of this movie starts with an exposition dump by Princess Aurelian, who like somebody figured out on Photoshop they can make her fade in and out of the screen. So that's just what's happening. Like her face is just fading in and out. She has this whole monologue in the beginning, and then her only line in the movie is, "Father!" which I find very funny. then the next scene is more exposition about the planets, explaining the planets. Then it's political exposition, explaining the houses. Then we cut to Paul looking at his computer with more exposition about what's happening. And this has to be the worst start to a movie I have ever seen in my entire life.
Yeah, so imagine the scene in Star Wars where like Obi-Wan and Luke are kind of going over Princess Leia's message, and then just expand that to like an hour. Like no one really moves out of that space. They're just kind of telling you about all this stuff.
God.
And like that's also what's so funny about like the end of it, because so little of it really circles back around to all of this stuff that they're setting up. I don't know. They don't do enough world building at the end of this film, certainly to really make it pay off. There's no tension. There's nothing. You're just like, okay, now I know a lot about this world, and very little of it was actually used. How much really needs to be explained? It's like, these two houses hate each other.
Yeah.
One's trying to like kill the other one because there's this, you know, the spice melange is what everyone needs, and it's very precious and all of that. And, you know, I don't know, it's just incredible.
Well, and also the ecological themes of this book. I think it's not until 1,000 years later that they can finally make this planet somewhat sustainable and rich in water. Yet at the end of this movie, Paul just makes it rain, like Jesus. And that's where the movie ends. It's like, well, problem solved. We did it.
Yeah, just straight up. Yep. I don't know what else to say about it. They just totally ruin their own setups and things like that. I guess that's a display of his awesome power or whatever, but they've just spent so many pages in this book being like, well, okay, so he's all powerful. It's like, all right, so there's no what's on the line anymore. I don't understand.
And also something that I that got annoying over time, because in the book people kept not understanding what water was, and I think the author kept trying to remind us of that, but like by the 5th time that they're like, what's rain? Water from the sky? I'm like, okay, I get it, like it's a desert planet. They cut all of that out from the movie, which I like, those scenes where like somebody cries and it's they're so awestruck because somebody's like wasting water by crying. Yes. And like, what's a boat? Like, and Paul has to explain it. None of that is in the movie. And also the outfits, because it's a movie and you have to show the actors' faces, nobody's really covered for the desert. You know, I didn't feel like in the desert setting. So at the end, when it's finally raining, I didn't feel like a big thing, because it wasn't really demonstrated to me enough that to these people, what is the value of water?
Yeah, like how rare it is on the planet. They really just kind of go over it with like, well, you have the still suit. But I mean, there's a million small ways that they talk in the book about how water's precious. Like, I forgot the first like Fremen who's explaining the importance of the Chris knife or whatever. And he spits on the table, and of course to like Paul and the Atreides, that's like a sign of disrespect to spit. But you know, to the Fremen, because water is so rare, they're like, oh my god, he expended some water, and you also need to expend some water to tighten this pact or whatever. It doesn't exist in the film. It's just totally bowled over.
Well, and I thought the costumes were another one of those things, because you were talking about the sets. The only thing that didn't really check out for me was that still suit, because why would it be black in the desert, especially if they're constantly trying to fit in, you know?
Yes.
That was the only choice that I thought was very strange. But if you look at some of the Bene Gesserit outfits are so incredibly detailed. There's so many patterns on that uniform. The costumes that the Princess Irulan wears, they're all like black and white, and they're these like lush, like, I don't know, Renaissance like gowns. I'm like, wow, that is some really cool stuff. Like there's some definite talent and skill that worked in this movie.
For sure. Just another quick note about the still suits. They go over this in the film because, you know, it's like, let's wow the people in the audience with the cool technology of these just like, you know, kind of dull black suits that they're wearing. And they make sure that the audience knows that they are pooping and peeing into their suits, and the suits are storing them around the thigh area. So for every scene beyond that explanation, just imagine that there's poo just kind of circulating around the thigh area of everyone as they're running around. I don't know. That just like cracks me up.
Yeah.
But it's like, I don't know. I don't even remember the book talking about like, no one can poo. They just poo into this suit, and then like a compost toilet in there.
I think they do, but it really makes no sense because the suit is like so tight to your skin. Like,
yes.
No, it makes no sense. Okay, I have to talk about the whispering.
Yes. Okay, let's do it.
Half of this movie is just whispering, which drives me a little crazy. Like, if I listen to too much whispering, I kind of get this, like, crawling under my skin feeling. And
it's asthma.
Well, no. I watch a lot of ASMR, but I don't watch a lot of the whispered ones, because I'm like, just speak up. A lot of the whispering was just either exposition, or it was just repeating the previous line. So an actor like said something, and then another actor thought that in his mind. And I'm like, yes, I just heard it. Why are you repeating it to me in voiceover? Because many books have been made into movies, and they've all managed to figure out how to translate inner thoughts into like a film.
Yeah, so I guess the critical thing about this book is that the narrating style is like they're constantly going in the heads of all the characters, and you know, you get kind of the thought process of each of them. And the movie just decides to do exactly that. They literally just have the voices that kind of play.
Yep.
And you're supposed to, because the lips aren't moving on these people on screen, you're supposed to recognize that they are saying this in their head. It's set at a quiet volume, and it like completely takes you out of the scene. I don't know. You feel,
it does. Yeah.
You feel very much like I mean, it's, I don't know. I've never seen the sort of like narrator option done like that in a film. Sorry.
There's a reason why we have not seen that, because it doesn't work.
this is the object lesson that every other director saw and was like, okay, I will not do that. And we haven't seen it since. And now we know that the solution is to shoot it like The Office, where each of the characters are like pulled aside, or like April Ludgate, where they just kind of like look at the screen with like, this is happening kind of eyes. They could have reshot the whole film like that. I'm looking forward to the 2020 remake where they just do that.
I wanted to say something about the fight choreography, because it's just people lifting up their hands, and then some people are on zip lines flying around. And
We're talking about the weirding ways.
The weirding ways, and also the scene in the beginning, because it's so campy that, like, I love it, and I'm not saying that in an ironic way. I'm just like, this is where we were. I can kind of get into it, and I like it, and I don't know, it's like charming almost.
They really don't do too much in terms of fighting that really makes it seem like the abilities that the Bene Gesserit have, or that Paul has with the weirding ways, are that impressive. Because like when he fights the Baron Harkonnen's son, is that Fade Ralph? I forget who.
I think so.
When he fights Sting, Sting, really gets close to killing him. And this is when Paul is like at his maximum powers or whatever. And after he's trained his whole army, and that's like why they're so effective at it. It's just like, this guy has done nothing all movie except just like flex in his underwear, and he like almost takes down Paul.
Yeah.
The fighting is just like totally mystifying. Yeah. Also, they go through that awesome scene where there's the obelisk or whatever, and for some reason, the weirding ways and like the killing word allows you to shoot an obelisk apart with like one blast or something like that.
I looked that up because so David Lynch didn't want to do like fighting choreography like in the desert and on the sand, so he came up with these like modules that just project your voice. But that scene that you just mentioned of the stone just like shattering and flying everywhere, and half of the room is now blind because they have shards of rock in their eyes.
Yes. Yep.
It's supposed to be super cool, but I'm watching that and I'm like, is this an OSHA violation? Like, is this like safe workplace? I'm like, Paul, come on.
I don't see the PPE on all these people.
Yeah.
The fighting, it's like, the first Star Wars or whatever, where they just have like two people kind of awkwardly swinging around a sword before they really thought about like, well, maybe we should call someone who has any idea of what to do with a sword. You're not really supposed to focus on the choreography so much as like the emotion or whatever behind it.
Huh.
And on some level, I appreciate that. But also now that we're like so saturated with choreographed fight scenes where they have hired people to do this, it's very noticeable.
Yeah. Sorry, I just keep going through so many notes. Just interrupt me if you have anything else to say.
You keep hitting all my favorite things. But I mean, I'm just so glad we talked about the two guys who are running the dry vac do a totally shit job of it. That's the funniest thing in the movie to me.
So the scene where Sean Young appears and introduces herself to Paul, she does some of the worst acting I've ever seen, because she just keeps lifting her eyebrows. Like, you have to go back if you ever rewatch that. And she was in Blade Runner 2 years before this. Same with Lady Jessica, who's just like hysterical and like not strong at all, even though she's probably the strongest character in the book. So things like that make me wonder, is this just the direction? Because I've seen both of these actresses in other things and they're fantastic. Like, something just must have gone wrong, because like it's not.
Yeah, and it's also kind of inconsistent. I mean, I guess Jessica does kind of go back and forth between this, but I mean, the Bene Gesserit are supposed to be very staid, very considerate of their motions and their outward emotional displays, because they're not trying to let on, and they're always trying to manage for the emotions and perceptions of other people. And no, they do not do that at all in the film. That is not communicated one bit, except for probably some expository element, like I must not betray my inner feelings or something like that. But that's pretty much it.
And this was the character where I was like, oh wow, they really let this character down. Because especially when she says like, oh, I will teach you this way of fighting, and then that scene never happens. Paul is the one teaching them how to fight. Jessica's such an incredible character, probably my favorite character in the book. And she's just kind of dropped. And I was looking at the crew for the 2020 version because it's the same director who did the new Blade Runner.
Yes. Yeah.
And the female representation in that movie was a little bit archaic too. Like, it was not the best I've ever seen. So that, and all the writers are male. Like, most of the crew is male, and it doesn't give me like a really good feeling of them doing that character justice this year with the new movie coming out. I'm kind of like iffy about that.
I mean, there's so many things that I'm iffy about because, I mean, this is a very Orientalist novel to begin with. And for some reason, we keep remaking it, in spite of the fact that we have thoroughly critiqued Orientalism. And then there's all the weird sexist things. We're like, so Jessica gives birth to Paul in the first place because she loves her husband so much, in spite of the fact that it's like totally against B'nai Gesserit's protocol. And she was specifically instructed to give birth only to girl children. But, you know, she's so enamored with her husband and he really wants it. So why not just throw out thousands of years of bloodline preparation or whatever? There's just all this weird stuff. But then I'm so cautious about what this next movie is going to be like. I forgot the name of the director, but I saw Blade Runner 2049 or 2040. I forget what it was actually called.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it was like, okay, for the most part, but the sets were great.
Oh my God. Yeah.
The sets and the colors, like all of the palettes that they chose. I mean, just in terms of world building, I am very interested. But in terms of literally every element otherwise, I don't know what story like you want to end up telling with this. Okay, so like, let's say we have a more racially diverse cast of Atreides or whatever. That doesn't make the like enslavement of the Middle Eastern population or like the thinly veiled Muslim population on this planet like any better. Like, what is the modern element they're going to like try to tie in with this?
Yeah.
I like have tried to think like, are they going to use this as a critique of the war on terror and like our sort of hubris with being like, yeah, we'll just empower the Afghanis or whatever, and then it goes bad. But like the message of the book is that they're too much of religious fanatics, and that is ultimately their downfall. And that is a terrible message to have in the modern day. And I just don't know where they're going to go with the sort of political elements of this.
Yeah, I was looking at Duncan Idaho, which is, I think, a really great character, and I'm really upset that he just gets killed off. I don't like a lot of character deaths, and that's probably just like a reflex muscle I've developed after breaking up with Game of Thrones, because I would always rather choose character development over introducing a character to me and then getting rid of that character. I find that a little bit pointless. But
sure.
Duncan Idaho is specifically described as a person of color in the book. He's a white guy in the movie, of course, because, again, of course, it's the 80s. But Jason Momoa is playing that character in the new one. So I'm kind of looking forward to that and the more racially diverse cast. But then again, what you said, what is that? Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, the one good thing is, of course, that the Atreides, even though they're kind of the protagonists of the film, are definitely not good in a lot of ways, is, I think, where you can kind of potentially get in a useful message or something along, you know, something closer to a proper political message that you can, you know, that is valid or is worth making, and that isn't just like horribly racist and so forth. I mean, every time I've seen a movie or a sci-fi thing, like Star Trek 2 tried to wrangle with our legacy in the Middle East and totally messed it up. I mean, It was literally just about like, well, like I forget all the different characters in it, but it was literally just about like, well, what do you do with all the people who are radicalized as a result of this war that just had, you know, tons of civilian casualties and stuff like that, and there's terrorists or like a villain that has come out of this. And like, where is your responsibility in this? How do you actually respond to it? And then like the last 60 minutes of the film, basically, they totally throw out all of that sort of like world building out the door. And it just becomes like a Universal Studios ride or something like that. We're just like riding through all these set pieces and CGI and so forth. Yeah. So I have no confidence in the ability of Hollywood to like tell a good or useful story about lessons we should learn from our military adventurism and like the Middle East and so forth. But hey, maybe I'll be surprised.
No, that's really good insight. I would totally agree with that, definitely. But then also the other thing that you said about the settings in the world of Blade Runner. Like when I watched the new one, I was back there. I was like, wow, somebody actually kind of was able to recreate that, and it was such a beautiful movie to look at. And I think that he's going to do a really good job with Dune, because, for example, Harkonnen and Caladan in this movie were so dark, and I didn't quite understand why. Like, everything was always like shot in this really dark way. It was always nighttime. When especially Caladan, I imagine these like, you know, just boats on a river and this like rainforest setting and like these, I don't know, tropical birds and
it's like an oceanic planet.
Yeah. So I hope that they do a really cool little thing with that, but again, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the aesthetics of this film are going to be very cool. And Blade Runner 2049, there's a huge set piece they have with this like building that's being basically swallowed up by the sand. So like, I already trust this director's ability to kind of produce a sort of desert world structure in a lot of ways, and I'm curious how he's going to keep evolving it and kind of tie it to the Dune universe. He seems like a great world builder, and Dune, if nothing else, is full of pretty rich details about how the world functions and how it looks, even if sometimes they're contradictory or kind of nonsensical, but it's there. There's like it's a rich text for a lot of this, to kind of certainly get a basis for a really cool piece.
Well, you know what I thought was actually a really cool scene as well in this one is when Paul and Jessica are in the desert and they walk around this rock, and as they walk around, you see all the Fremen like standing right there, and then there's like a lightning. I don't know if you remember that, but I was like, oh, I wish there was more of that. Like, that was a really cool, like, oh my God, there they are kind of moment.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much potential here. And David Lynch did a decent job with a lot of it, and I think his embellishments and his own creations on some of it were just really cool in some ways. So there's a lot of good, a lot of bad. So thumbs up or thumbs down on this in general? Did you enjoy it? I mean, how do you even rate something like this?
Okay. I'm not gonna say it's a good movie, but whether I like a movie is different from it being a good movie. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, you could never say like this was a good movie. I don't think, as a critical human being with a brain. Like, but yeah, I definitely did enjoy parts of it. I think what just took me out of it was the body horror and just some of the performances just also being so clownish. Especially the Harkonnens. I'm thinking here also of the nephews, and then also Peter DeVries, which that actor just had like crazy facial hair and like was so extra all the time. His eyes were always popping out of his head, and I'm like, that's not a marker anymore for somebody being evil. It's just, I think you watch that nowadays and you're just like, oh, that's a little embarrassing and ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. Like, given things like good or bad as kind of an arbitrary thing, I think there's a lot of compelling moments and compelling ideas in some of this, which is probably part of the reason that Dune has some shelf life, but probably also a good chunk of it is that people don't actually read books. I say that, right. I guess probably a bit stuck up, but it's also true.
This book is a tough one to get through.
Yeah, but a lot of people read it, and it's already in the culture, so I don't know.
Yeah. That's true. You know who's not in the culture? Patrick Stewart. I have this hilarious story about him, which I don't know if you found out in your research. So they shoot this in Mexico. People in Mexico City are like going bananas because Sting is coming to town. Patrick Stewart has no idea who Sting is. Never heard of him. They shoot their first scene together, and he's like, "Oh, I heard you're a musician. What instrument do you play?" And Patrick Stewart being deeply uncool is so relatable, and I think it's why we love him so much.
Oh my God. That rules. That's so good.
That was my last note. I think that was everything we had. I couldn't believe that Toto did the music for this. I kept looking up if that was a joke, but it's not. I was pretty impressed because the music rules.
Yeah, I mean, the soundtrack is very good for the most part. I hate any sort of rock that is constructed for film or theater, for that matter. I always just think it sounds like a bad parody of rock, which is my only criticism of it. But, you know, for the film, it works. It does what it's supposed to do.
It's not even that rocky at times. Like sometimes it's just kind of like these atmospheric.
Yeah.
I don't know. I thought there was a real nuance to this that made it all kind of work together.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a soundtrack and not like, unlike A Star is Born, where there's like the rock song that they have to play.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just like big and dumb and it sucks. It's real bad. It's definitely supposed to be like an atmospheric piece in the same way that, all other orchestral pieces in this are meant to be.
I didn't know we were coming after A Star is Born in this episode.
I can go after that one, but we'll save that.
All right. Anything else that you had to say about Dune?
Nope. Nothing that we haven't really already said. David Lynch is a strange fellow, and I really appreciated his vision on this. I don't think he had anything else that really compares to like a project like this. So, and it's impressive on its own ways, but I also am just so confused by why the culture keeps propagating this book in particular. There's so many problems with it. And bringing it into the modern era is very suspicious, but we'll see what they manage to do with it.
Jason, thanks for coming back on the podcast. Tell the people where they can find you. Tell them about Future Cities.
Oh, yeah. I am also a co-host of the Future Cities podcast, which you can get on Stitcher or iTunes. And I think we're on Spotify as well. So pretty much where all podcasts are sold, you can find us. It's about urban ecology and making cities more resilient to climate change and extreme weather events, which is what I do professionally.
So it's real science, not this.
Yes. I mean, yes, sure. It's all what is science? It's mostly papers. It's a lot of theoretical stuff. So is it really any more real? I mean, this has set pieces. They're constructing stuff. I haven't built anything.
But thank you again so much. And I hope you stay safe and healthy out there in this crazy time.
You stay safe too. Bye, Tabea.
And how can this be? For he is the Kwisatz Haderach.